Okay. Hi, everybody. This is our final presentation of this afternoon. And as you know, we will be back again on Thursday and Friday from 1 to 4. I am really glad to introduce our next speakers, Beth Bouloukos, Director of the Amherst College Press and Lever Press, Elizabeth Crowley Weber, Senior Production Editor at Georgetown University Press, and Ana Maria Jimenez-Moreno, Acquisitions Editor at the Ohio State University Press. And we're going to talk about publishing and inclusive language. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the intro. So we wanted to just say quickly that the way that we had conceived of this panel was really to be a conversation amongst the three of us, but also with the audience. So we really want to hear what you have to say and what you think about inclusive language, what it means to you in whatever area that you work in. So we really suggest putting not just questions in the chat, but also comments that you have. Liz is going to be monitoring those as we go along. And we were thinking of this also as a learning experience for us. So please feel free to share what you're thinking as we're going along. So we thought we would start the panel that's about inclusive language with our own definitions and how we're using them in the work that we do in publishing. So I think, Anna, you were going to start.
Yes, thank you, Beth. So I'm taking poaching from the definition created by the Coalition for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications. Their website is c4disc.org. I would highly suggest you look at them, and I think their representative, Nicole Coggins, from that group, is also presenting tomorrow. So it says that inclusion isn't the act of establishing philosophies, policies, practices, and procedures to ensure equitable access to opportunities and resources that support individuals in contributing to the organization's success. And it's also through encouraging awareness. So in some, I think it's an active, ongoing process, echoing a lot of things that were talked about during the plenary. It's not just, okay, we're here, we are inclusive at now, and it's already a goal, it's a destination. It is something that you actively do in your practice, in your day, in your communications. So I think like I said, I will reiterate that very useful definition that was worked on by people who have thought about this a lot, but also in that, again, a very active voice, very active way of thinking about inclusivity.
Great. And Liz, what about you?
I think I'd, of course, echo everything that Anna just said, and that's a great resource. So I hope that folks who weren't aware of it make use of it. But I think that in manuscript editorial, we often bump into inclusive language more in terms of what it's not. I think there's a lot of misconstruing inclusive language with the hot button word political correctness. And I think those are two really different projects. Whereas political correctness is using wording to avoid offending people who are marginalized, I think inclusive language is using wording to strategically include those people who might otherwise, be excluded from the book. It's also, someone I think at one of the ACEs conferences I went to recently on this said it's imagining the widest readership for your book possible, which often I think about a lot. Is the person that, the author has imagined as the reader? Can I imagine all the kinds of bodies that are going to encounter this book, all the kinds of people, where they are, how they read, and are we really thinking about, setting up as many people as possible for being able to kind of take in this book. And I also think when we get over to the design and production part of my job, inclusive language also is visual language. When we're talking about images being included, are we including alt text so that someone who's, unable to see the image can still process it and still understand it and still read it? Are we thinking through, how we are representing people on the cover of the book? So it's a lot, but I think that the project in and of itself really comes back to the reader. And And who do you think the reader is? Is it the dominant group reader, or is it something bigger than that?
Yeah. So I think that's great. And I think what you were saying about thinking about audience is also really important. And I think for when we usually talk about inclusive language in publishing, we're often most thinking about sort of the words that we publish themselves in the books or on the books. But we really have to think about the dissemination as well, and who is going to have access to these words that we are in some ways helping to shape and make as inclusive as possible. And so from my side, we have 2 open access presses. And so what does it mean when we're doing open access publishing to use inclusive language when the readership could be far beyond scholars who are sort of initiated in that field of study, right? So we're doing things that are being read on every continent at this point. We get the list of countries where our books are being used, and it's really remarkable, but that comes with it, I think, a really high need for thinking about what inclusive language means when you have such a broad readership. And I think we need to be invested, especially for OA publications, in thinking about this type of readership that is beyond sort of scholars in a sub field of a discipline, perhaps for some specialized monographs, right? And the other thing is that I think we need more attention paid to process. And so how we use inclusive language with our colleagues, with our peer reviewers, with authors, how we talk about authors as well in the process. We often gender authors, a year or 2 years before we even get their marketing questionnaire and know how they would like to be referred to. And so I think that beyond just thinking about what it is that we're using for a certain term in a chapter, we need to think about how we're addressing people in the process through every stage. So I think it is incredibly broad when we are having to tackle this sort of topic right now. So I think that kind of weaves into what both of you are saying, and we'll talk more about these things, I think, as we go on.
Yeah, I think that's right. I should mention, words are important, and like what words you're using are important. Someone earlier in the APA panel referred to their bias-free language guide. And if you're not familiar with that, I would strongly encourage you to navigate over there because it is very helpful. They've done a lot of research, and they've really done that work on what words to use when you're talking about all kinds of things. I guess one question I had for both of y'all, given that I'm over here in editorial, and so I don't see the start of the process. So as acquisitions editors who are signing projects, how do you navigate the question of, how are you soliciting? What words are you using to solicit manuscripts? Who gets to tell what stories? And what does inclusive language mean sort of in your daily life?
Yeah, so I can start answering that question. So I think for me, it's intentionality. It kind of starts with that. I know we can really get into the habit of reaching out to the same kind of series editors, the same readers, the same authors, because they're time tested and they have kind of delivered a product for us. But sometimes you do have to branch out into kind of different areas. But again, that intentionality is. It's hard to produce. I mean, it's time, but I think it's very important to not see it as this auxiliary, it's here on the side, but as the main part of how you do your work. So also making sure that it's understood that our commitment is institutional, in the sense that it's not just, a hot topic, so I'm just going to reach out to people that are already overburdened or already sought after by everyone, because now it's interesting. It's the ethical reason of institutionally, this is what we've done and this is what we want to keep on exploring, keep on supporting, whether that's in your wheelhouse. Sometimes it's great because part of the institutional history is to have done that, is to have already kind of focused on Black studies, for example, or Latinx studies, and that's wonderful. But then saying you're committed, not only in thinking about commitment in terms of what are the needs of that particular author or that field in terms of conferences, but really making sure that they are educated. Some of us came from those backgrounds themselves, from academia, and so making sure that they are educated about the process of publishing and don't just assume that, oh, they know what the deal is. They don't need to ask questions about, Article 3B of their contract. Sometimes I know as publishers, we can think, oh gosh, royalties sometimes. But, they have a right to ask about these things and to be informed and be educated. And again, being part of that process, not really, sometimes I feel as if we get impatient with authors, like, oh, don't they know this? Or, to keep that pipeline, keep that publishing process going. But it really is sometimes a matter of taking the time at a conference or in Zoom call or a phone call, old school, I guess now, or an email, and just explaining things bit by bit. And that's kind of what I always try to do, whether I think they've been published, they've published 7 books or none. Making sure that I go over what our publishing process is, whether sometimes it's, they just experienced it as a sort of whirlwind experience, and didn't really think, okay, what happened first and last. So I think it's inclusive language. It's making sure you reach them on their level with their needs, with their commitments, and be very well intentioned about who are the readers, what can I do in this field or in this area or for this author.
Yeah, that's great. I love this idea of thinking about what language we use to solicit manuscripts and what language we use, Anna, to talk to authors. You think of language like subventions or these things that some people going through the process for the first time, it might actually not be inviting them in and welcoming them into the university press world. And how can we do a better job of sort of slowing down, taking the time to explain terms in a way that is inclusive. And at one point, I think, Liz, you had mentioned something about thinking about how we name series and how that plays into the acquisitions process. And I think, we have to be very deliberate about that. That is appropriate for the type of authors and the type of topics that we want to attract. But I think we also need to be good about encouraging series editors sometimes to rename series. Some presses have these. At SUNY, I have this series that was running since like the 70s or something that I inherited. And there was a discussion about, well, okay, do we need to rename this? Do we need to use different kind of wording in the titles to signal that this is a very contemporary series and we want it to be as inclusive as possible, even though it started in, a time when different language was used, right? So I think that sometimes we can be scared about renaming series because they're known in a certain way, especially the successful series that have gone on for a long time, but to not be so committed in that way, to be open. And I think a lot of this is about a type of openness to language. And like Barbara was saying before, language that we use is incredibly important, right? And so being open to change and being open to looking at things from a different perspective. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of style guides and house styles and other topics that will come up. But that was why I was so excited to have this conversation, to learn a little bit more from both of you and from the people who are joining.
Right. And in terms of learning, I mean, certainly, we take the project up to a certain point, but Liz, after we received the author's final manuscript, obviously we're not just turning a Word document out into a PDF or, whatever files, EPUB. Can you talk a little bit about what happens in editorial and what safeguards there are in terms of inclusive language and other topics surrounding this?
Yeah, so I think that we're really lucky in university publishing to have peer review. And I think that that's a huge help for a lot of reasons. Peer reviewers can sometimes be your sort of saving grace there, because they can say the things that maybe acquisitions editors didn't want to say or didn't notice because they didn't have time. And so in like 9 out of 10 times when we encounter a project over in manuscript editorial, a final manuscript, the problems really are on the like word by word level. So for example, there's a lot of the use of the pronoun he, or even he or she. And I would always press an author on that to consider, you know, using the gender neutral they, or revising, so you don't need to gender someone that, you know, is a made up like kind of straw person. So that's like the easiest thing, I think, because our copy editors are really well trained to kind of encounter bias-free language, or encounter bias language, and edit it so that it is, you know, bias-free language. The stickier parts, I think, are when you get a manuscript into manuscript editorial, and hopefully I would notice as a managing editor if there was sort of an overarching problem, but maybe I have a pile of transmittals on my desk and I just read the introduction and figured out like, okay, this would be great with XYZ copy editor, and I'll send it along. Only to receive an email from the copy editor who's, you know, three chapters in and notices a much larger problem. And again, this is sort of like a worst case scenario. So I'm the first sort of person who sees it, who I hope would catch it in EDP, but sometimes I don't. And then our copy editor can be a kind of canary in the coal mine. And this is like a big sentence level, chapter level issue. Like, for example, maybe it's a book, you know, about, it's like a ostensibly book that's speaking toward a marginalized group, and yet none of the citations are from someone, you know, from that group, or it seems to be really taking the point of view of perhaps like a white reader, and the book is, you know, creating a kind of sort of racist vision of the world. So these are like huge problems I'm talking about right now, which we hope never to encounter, but it does happen. In that, when I need to be able to, at that point, go to our acquisitions editor and sort of say to them like, hey, I didn't see this. Our copy editor brought it up. I looked at the reader reports. I don't really see anything there either. What do you think we together should do? I think you have to have a culture of open communication, because what you don't need is someone trying to like me hustling over here to try and line edit a project that's inherently problematic, when I needed to have a conversation with the acquisitions editor to sort of problem solve together. So it's sort of a worst case scenario, but most of the time we just, you know, are able to sort of query things and work with the author. I usually first and foremost just like ask the author, and this in terms of, I'm like a real, I really love the Subversive Copy Editor. I think if you don't have a copy of this book, you should go run out and get it. But in that book, it really stresses like flexibility and transparency. And so I think when you're talking about words, reaching out to an author and saying, you know, I noticed that you used he when you were talking about physicians. I don't think you meant to do that, but if you did, like, can we have a conversation about it? I usually send a link to the APA style guide, bias-free style guide, and say, you know, usually now I would suggest you follow this and we use they, or we rewrite so that you don't need to gender. And most times authors are, you know, oh no, I didn't realize I did that. Like, yes, please have the copy editor help me. So it's, I pitched a sort of like dramatic situation that doesn't usually happen, but most often we can kind of work it out between me, the copy editor, and the author. And all of it's in like the project of making the book as good as it can be. So I think authors are mostly like really grateful and really happy to kind of work on this project with you. They don't want to put something out into the world that's going to do harm. And if they do, then that's when we have a conversation with the acquisitions editor. Does that answer your question? Does that get it? Like, okay.
Yeah,
it
I
is
like
such
the
a
approach of not being accusatory. I think that's like opening a conversation. I saw that you use this term. I'm not sure if you mean it in this way, and as opposed to you can't say that. That's I think to put people on the defensive, they might come around a little bit more to seeing that the APA's guide for bias-free language is actually how they want to write, right? So
yeah, it is all, I always defer to I never want to send a redlined manuscript to an author with a sort of intensive rewriting without having first sort of primed them for that and gotten buy-in. You have to get buy-in from the author, in my opinion. That's how I like to do it. I usually say something, this is probably going to come straight out of the subversive copy editor, but it's before I meddle, I noticed you did this. Instead, would you care if we made a change, ... So you can be tactful with it, but at the end of the day, you can't put outdated language in a book that a group of people have specifically said is damaging to them. And there are very few hills I die on, but that's one of them. So yeah, we had a few other questions here. Oh, I guess this is one thing we had chatted about in our prep call. And I mean, I guess this is the worst case scenario. What do you as acquisitions editor, or Beth, even as a press director, do if you have an author who is under contract, who has a book out or has a book in production, and for lack of a better word, the project being problematic becomes very clear, or the author's actions become very clearly against sort of best practices of inclusion, or at the worst they do something that's just sort of egregious. So how do you two sort of work your way through that question?
Anna, did you want to start?
Sure. I'll start. So I think we try to avoid getting to that point. Quite honestly, I haven't had direct experience in quite that extreme example. I think the most that has happened, so far, was an author who was kind of disrespectful to the copy editor, who blamed them for mistakes that they introduced. So it wasn't kind of what was the content of it in the sense that, was it wrong, or were there these kind of ethical issues? But it's basically their approach to somebody who, again, is doing all this wonderful labor on their behalf, on the press's behalf. So I honestly don't want to work with them again, and we hope that that they will make other decisions about who they publish with. But I think there's also, we try to avoid that again by trying to be very intentional in our feedback, in whenever we view the proposal or skim the manuscript, and then in who we find as our readers, to fill in a certain gap. So are they speaking, from, for example, I have narratology. So are they, and their project includes Asian American studies. So we want to find somebody who is solidly in narratology and in Asian American studies, to see if they're actually, are they bringing in interesting material from Asian American studies, or that's actually their co-audience. And audience is a big issue. But also in terms of our questionnaire, and recently that was a hot topic on the AUP listserv about how do we create inclusive language or equitable language around these issues in our questionnaire. And we have ourselves updated that to reflect current conversations. Again, it's always a very malleable document. Hopefully we all think of that. So we provoke kind of questions in terms of citations, like who are you citing? Is everybody from 1970? And hopefully that doesn't go into peer review, but if it's a project on women, that it's citing women, things of that nature. And then we have our other processes, which again, we hope that these things would be weeded out. In terms of having to get it contracted, we usually have an internal staff meeting where again, maybe some of these issues come up, especially again, if somebody is close reading the reader reports with you, and certainly when we go to the board and have to advocate for the project on that way. And again, it's one of those scary things that yes, things can still slip up during that time, but and again, hopefully the board will be on board with you to eliminate some of that language. I would be interested to know, and this could be a much later question of, once a book is out there, how do you make yourself responsible for again, what is already out there in not just in physical books, but in metadata, in repository archives and things like that. But again, maybe Beth obviously might have some experience with that.
Yeah, one thing I think that we're able to do is to do some, and I like this conversation again about sort of coaching people through the process, is to think about how also power dynamics are involved in this, and how sometimes maybe there's an acquisitions editor who's just starting out. They have a book with somebody really huge in the field, and they're worried about saying, well, you can't really use this term, or it's not the best, most inclusive term to use, for example. And the reverse can be true, right? Could be an author who it's their first book, they have a lot riding on this, super well-known acquisitions editor that maybe all of their heroes kind of publish with or something. And so I think that, of course, we can fall back on these style guides. You can have a house style, which sometimes, if somebody is being difficult in terms of wanting to change the language that they're using, you can say, well, that's our house style. And you can use that to kind of lead someone in the right direction. But mostly I find people are happy when you bring these things up, because, I'm not an expert on free speech, for example, but I do have some experience in helping you not publish a book you're going to be embarrassed about in like 2 years or something, or now. And so I think that generally speaking, people are really open to those conversations, and especially after you explain to them why they can't use the language that they're using, or why it would be hurtful to use the language that they're using. And I think that we have to all recognize that we make mistakes. And I recently used a term that somebody told me was ableist in a newsletter that I wrote, and I was really grateful for that person to point it out. It's not language that, so I was saying that like we were standing for this and using that word as kind of like a, empowered term or something. And so somebody pointed that out to me, and I think it was super useful for my own awareness. So I'm hoping that, we can all do that with our colleagues and with our authors as well.
Yeah,
but I
think
can
that's
feel
right.
From the press level standpoint, you can have a lot of presses now are talking about ethics clauses, right? And so that's something that we're working on. There are a few presses already that have them. We've brought our interns into that process, which I think is really interesting, because they have a lot of input and education for us about what they think sort of anti-racist terms are, what they think is inclusive language. And so I do recommend actually bringing in people like at every level of the press into those kind of conversations.
Yeah, I think that's right. There was the recent, I guess, demographic study of publishing showed that like the greatest gains in moving the needle on hiring a more kind of diverse workforce were happening at the entry level. And so looping people in who are not, perhaps maybe wouldn't have usually been looped into some of these decisions or style guides, or, how you handle things, I think is really helpful. And we should all be doing that more. But I have a few questions in the Q&A that I'll pose to you guys. The first one is, it's wonderful when a copy editor's suggestion can help navigate between an acquiring editor and an author. But what happens when the copy editor doesn't integrate inclusive language? So that would be not great. We do try to, we vet our copy editors, and I have a good sense of what they are and are not sensitive to. So I think keeping a, diverse copy editor pool is really crucial. And if you don't if you're a managing editor out there and aren't aware of editors of color, it's a great place to sort of post your positions and like reach out and say, I want more people who maybe are not white, like 80% of apparently copyeditors are, if you followed the recent survey. So I think that diversifying your copyeditor pool is a great first step, but it can't just be on like diverse populations to kind of look out for inclusive language. So informing your copyeditors about your stance via a house style guide, as Beth suggested, is a really, a good action, I think. And staying up to date, like when this summer, the capitalization of Black was a change made across a number of style guides, reaching out to all of your copyeditors and ensuring that like they are aware, they are on board, and just kind of continuing that conversation. And we had the same thing happen with authors too, whose manuscripts were, in the pipeline, reaching out to them, letting them know the change and fixing it. The other question is, how do you approach person-centered language in situations where people consider their condition to be part of their identity? Some examples may include people with autism versus autistic people, or people who are deaf versus deaf people. Does anyone want to answer that? I can take a stab at it, which I always honor what people prefer, obviously. Like if this is somebody who's a real life person, I would go and look up something that they've said, a talk they've given, and honor how they refer to themselves. And the same thing is true, right, of pronouns, like trying to suss out how that person refers to themselves before you guess on their behalf. For a big group of people, I don't know what I would do. I guess I would pose the question to the author who's presumably writing on this topic and sort of pressing them to say, like, have you considered this? And just having that conversation so that whatever choice we make, we're thinking it through. And I think that there's a kind of misunderstanding of manuscript editorial that we're all about the rules, but we want to know the rules, but we're okay with breaking the rules. I think as long as there is intention and there is thoughtfulness, as Anna said at the very beginning, like this is all a learning process and language changes over time. So we have to sort of stay nimble.
Yeah, I think what's important is that whether or not the person is using it to describe themselves or others, but also that, again, I think not necessarily being rigid in this is the house style, so you absolutely can't use this. If there's a particular reason why, in this case, it is important and perhaps more inclusive, let's say, or it's how you personally identify, right? And so I've allowed authors to put notes about different terms that they've used and to explain why it is that they've used them, if it's for a really specific reason and somebody, might wonder why that was used, or even a term that's redacted, for example. So I think it's about, in those cases, being flexible in terms of opening up that conversation.
We have a question, I think for you, Beth, that maybe you can answer quickly because you're the one that I believe mentioned this, but what is an ethics clause and what would be included in that?
Yeah, they can be really far-ranging. Some of them are really short and just say, basically, if anything you do will reflect poorly on the press or on the mission of the university, let's say, that, contracts could be canceled or whatever the case may be. Some of them are far more specific. So there are different approaches to this, but you could think of an example for someone who maybe your book or their book you have control over in some aspect, right? So, we're hoping to have these conversations, but at the end of the day, we're the publisher, right? And so that's different than their Twitter account, or that's different than maybe how they're addressing people at a conference, which of course you have no control over. And so, it's thinking about how people are also treating the employees at your press, how employees are treating each other. And so there's a really wide range of ways to think about an ethics clause, but I think it's important that more presses do it.
I have another question here that's a big one, and we had talked about it amongst ourselves, thinking it might come up, but it's a question about freedom of speech and where that falls kind of in the project of inclusive language. Over the past, since 2020 started, which is even the past year, we've seen a number of sort of, I guess, controversy feels like the wrong word, but maybe that's the right word, where publishers have pulled books off of their lists because of the book's subject or who was writing it. And so what do we think about this? I'm sure we all have very different views. So I'm just curious what you both think, and then I can give my own 2 cents. But I guess the question is, like, what is the line between freedom of speech and inclusivity? Or is there a line?
Anna, did you want to start, or?
No, it's fine. You can go first.
Yeah, I think that, at the end of the day, we're the publisher and we're taking responsibility for something. And so, freedom of speech has been used a lot lately to really bolster language that is hurtful to people, and that many groups have said that it is hurtful to them, or it is alienating, and it is language that is not acceptable. And so I think that people, there are limits to freedom of speech, in my opinion. And of course, I'm no expert on this by any means, but there is something called a harm clause, right? And so if an author pushes it to extent that they're really adamant about using a term that is not appropriate, is biased, is racist, is whatever you feel is inappropriate. Again, at the end of the day, you're the publisher, so in some respect, you're taking responsibility for this. So I think that even in the world at large, freedom of speech has its limits, right? But especially when we're the publisher and we're curating lists that are reflecting upon our institutions, reflecting upon the scholarship that we hope to really be, amplifying in the world, that it is our responsibility to take this very seriously in terms of inclusive speech.
Yeah, I think one thing that you said there that we are the publisher, so this isn't as if where I get really confused, because I'm not a legal person, is like this conflation between, like, just because you can go out in the world and say it and no one can arrest you for whatever it is that you've said that's offensive, doesn't mean, I think, that we have to publish that, right? Like, it's a difference between, we're not trying to ban books over here, but we don't have to work on your book if we don't kind of think that it's helpful. Does that, I know there was like a big uproar, right, over several of these instances this summer. And I think people did have really differing opinions. And there are plenty of, I think, editors who would feel like they don't have to agree with everything they publish. It's really hard, I think, when you're in manuscript editorial, because you get what you get. Like, I'm not signing books. I get the books that, say, Beth acquired or Anna acquired and then transmitted to me. So I'm not really making those choices, but it does really weigh on you. And I think it weighs on you more now when you feel like the book you're working on could do harm to others. And I feel that especially with the university press. Like, if you put the imprimatur of peer review and like a storied institution on a book, that book is, saying something, that could be quoted or misquoted or misrepresented. I mean, that happens anyway. So I don't know. It's a hard project, but I guess I think it's something that we're all still thinking through. There's probably no good answer right now.
Yeah, I also know that, I mean, there's, with free speech, especially how it's protected inside the institution and what, with a person of power or authority, what they feel like they need to say, or kind of the counterpoint that they need to bring out. I think that, like you said, like what was said here, it needs to be counterbalanced with I guess what you're trying to say. But the problem also has come up where it's on the level of the book. Yes, of course, we can cite many examples, but there's, the book is no longer just, those physical pages printed there, but how it is, but how it exists elsewhere, how it exists on Twitter or on, in social media, and what the author does, with that content. But kind of on another level of this isn't, so much on free speech, but with libraries, or how it's cataloged, or how, I know that, how a book is put, even if the author has the intention of being this way, either be inclusive or be exclusive, but how then, is it categorized, and how does that affect, who accesses this book? I know has been kind of an issue. So, for example, if the medical humanities, and it wants to kind of, again, bind those two together, but if it gets our classification, it doesn't get to the audience that it wants to. And so, again, it's a little far field from what that question originally was about free speech. But I think there's the free speech of, again, what that book does, and then all the craziness that can come out of what an author does, or what the institution behind the author does, or what the Twitter followers do around that book. So I think those lines between that physical, concrete book with set metadata and the world after it, which has kind of always been a thing, right? Where those things are blurred, and where we can find trouble as well as publishers.
So I think we've been given our wrap it up notice by John.
Well, I want to thank you guys. This has really been great. This has been a great conversation, and it's really, there's a lot more that could be talked about this, obviously. We are fortunate that tomorrow we're going to hear more about these issues. We start out tomorrow with talk about the anti-racism toolkit for allies with Nicole Coggins, Margaret Fraser, and Randy Townsend. Tomorrow we'll also hear from Dr. Elizabeth Rule on developing the app Indigenous Guide to DC. We'll hear from Christopher Harris on open educational resources, and from Bill Kasdorf on Born Accessible. So thank you guys for this conversation, and I know it's a very ongoing and provocative topic, and I've learned a lot from listening to you. So thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
See you guys tomorrow.